And here's the thing. We know there are thousands of examples of what best defines the tragedy and the trauma of the pandemic. We can talk forever about job losses and mental health. These areas, of course, are well established. But I think for me, the issue that kind of really brings this into a tragic but a very sharp focus has to be care homes and the inability for people to just simply visit their relatives, usually their mum or their dad. It's hard to kind of think of a more troubling or upsetting sight. People trying to communicate, usually through a double glazed window, to a fragile 90-year-old, often with issues, dementia, something like that, doesn't really understand what's going on, but would just perhaps like a cuddle from their son or their daughter. And we've seen too much of this. And it doesn't just apply, by the way, to care homes for the elderly. I mean, there are care homes in all manner of respects. So disability, where your own child could be in a care home or a facility where you haven't been able to see them. I can hardly begin to get my head around this. I mean, I understand the difficulties. No way around this. I mean, people who literally didn't see their parents for the last year before they died. Their mum, their dad, was unable to go and give them a little hug. Was there really no way around that? Yesterday there was yesterday a bit of a beacon of hope, a scintilla of light. Banning relatives from visiting loved ones in care homes could be made illegal in Britain. Currently, visiting relatives inside care homes in England has been banned as part of the third coronavirus lockdown. New legislation has now been drafted to ensure families will no longer be forced to stay apart. Now, the proposal will be presented to Matt Hancock later today. The new legislation will give all residents of care homes the right to receive visits from a close friend or relative. Harriet Harman, the Labour MP, is leading the charge on this one. We'll talk to her in around about the next 10 minutes. I want to hear from you. We'll be speaking to people throughout this hour who've been in this terrible situation. If anything brings tragedy into the sharpest of focus, it is not being able to even talk or communicate properly with your mum or your dad, your son or your daughter. I can't think of anything more upsetting really than this in this whole scenario. When, there was a TV commercial that said at the beginning, I think it was for a bank or something, that started off with the slogan, "How are you?" And it was making the point that never have those words resonated more. Never have they been more prominent and more important to the human condition than they are right now. Just a "how are you?" Even from people that you don't often hear from. How are you? Inquiring about your work. How are you doing? Because that's sort of where we found ourselves, didn't we? And I don't know what about this third lockdown, but certainly in the first one, we did a few phone-ins on this. There was a kind of an interesting hope that this will change the human spirit and we'll all become kinder and nicer to each other, because we've had this, we've been through this kind of almost warlike scenario where all usual rules of engagement have changed. Everything on hold, life suspended. And you'd think during that time, you want to hear from your friends, you want to hear from people that you're close to. But more than anything, you want to hear from your mum and dad or your son or your daughter. That's really where it's at. Are they okay? Are they all right? And bearing in mind, we're fighting something that some of these people are in an age group and a disposition through their health where they are perhaps the most vulnerable. So there is a time component to this too. The idea that you want to cuddle your mum during a pandemic is probably the time you want to give her a hug most, but the time you're not allowed to give her a hug at all. Square that circle if you can. 0344 499 1000. If you've found yourself in this terrible situation, I can throw all the questions out there. I don't know the full answers. I get what people are saying, but we know there are many cases of this happening across the country. We played you that little clip at the beginning, and we'll be speaking to the granddaughter in that clip a little later in the programme too, just to get an update on where that's at. But there are many other examples.
Hello? Blow me kiss. Blow. I can't come in. We're not allowed yet because of that nasty bug. Blow me a kiss. Oh, don't cry. Don't cry.
I mean, it hardly gets any worse in terms of upsetting. Here's another example.
Oh, I can't wait to see you in person.
Yeah, me too, but I want you to know that I'm with you all the time.
Pretty soon I hope this quarantine will be over.
Yeah, but you understand why they have to do it.
We understand why they have to do it, or do we? Was there no way to circumnavigate this at a time when these people needed their family most, at the time when these people were absolutely desperate to hold hands, to look into the eyes, to hug, to talk, to communicate? Your own parent. I mean, it goes to the very roots of everything we're about, right? Your own mum. Not being able to hold the hand of your own mum. And to compound the tragedy, some people never ever did. They never got that chance. It was too late. 0344 499 1000. So I wanted to speak with you if you've been in this situation. And again, just to reiterate, this isn't just about elderly people. Anyone who's in any form of care, whether it's through disability, physical, mental, whatever the issue might be, you would have perhaps found yourself with exactly the same challenges as this, where the rule said, sorry, you're not allowed to pay a visit. I mean, imagine not being able to see your own child. There are, to take it to the next stage, stories of people whose kids went into hospital and they were never allowed to be with their own child in their final hours. How the heck, was there never a way around this? We hope there is now. We hope there's a scintilla of light. But if this has been your story and you've had this battle and you know what that feels like and you can completely identify with what that does to your heart, your mind and your soul, then I'm all ears at this end. 0344 499 1000. We'll chat to Harriet Harman, who will explain precisely what form this proposal, this legislation that's been drafted will take, and what hope there is of it changing anything. Because at the moment you can almost hear Matt Hancock saying, I know it's terrible, but we got no choice. Is there any other choice? I'd also ask you as well, if you're outside of this story, for an overview, an objective view on what you think on this. I mean, we threw this onto social media a little earlier, and lots of people straight away, and I'll read you some of them in a moment, said, look, it's terrible, but what's the option? What is the option? 0344 499 1000. And if you work in the care sector, where you've really been at the coalface of this whole thing, just explain these particular scenarios, how they pan out, how on earth you were able to... I mean, the idea that you've got to look somebody in the eyes and say, sorry, you can't see your mum or your child. Man alive. Later today, the proposals will be presented to Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, who will outline a plan to give all care home residents the right to receive visits from a close relative or friend. Harriet Harman is the Labour MP and chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, who also drafted this new legislation. Afternoon to you. So what's changed, Harriet Harman, here? I mean, Matt Hancock has outlined previously his sympathy and understanding, but said, there are very good reasons why you can't go and hug your mum. What's different now?
Well, I think the government's policy is right, and their policy is that the default position is that you should be able to have a face-to-face visit in recognition of how important it is for the quality of life for people in care homes, not just those who are suffering from dementia, but adults with learning difficulties or children with autism. Family visits are absolutely essential, and relatives feel completely distressed as they see care workers going in and out of the home, including sometimes temporary care workers who can be with their loved ones, but they can't, and they fear they're deteriorating and feel just that they've been abandoned. So the government's policy is right, which is that unless there's a specific risk in relation to a particular individual home or a particular individual in that home, then family visits should be allowed. The problem is that policy is not being implemented by care homes across the country, and therefore we need to make the guidance which the government put out have the force of law, because some people have not seen their relatives for a year, and many of them felt quite anguished that they're not actually at home. And they're sort of thinking, I thought if we put her in a home, at least we could see her every day or every week. And now we haven't been able to do that. So it's causing terrible anguish.
How do we address this issue that a lot of our listeners have picked up on, Harriet, that, we understand the trauma, we understand the anguish, but, there is a pandemic out there. You start letting people mix, and before you realise it, there's a spread. And we know about the focus on care homes in that respect. How do we square that circle?
Well, nobody wants any risk to be taken with the pandemic, least of all care homes where there's been tens of thousands of deaths. But I think that we should approach it in the same way that they do in Canada, which is they treat a relative as part of the care team, so that for the purposes of personal protective equipment, for the purposes of testing, for the purposes of vaccination, they treat a relative the same as they treat the members of staff, so that you can have one relative who's like seen as part of the care team. And that is the reality of it, because it takes a team to care for somebody in residential care, and that's dedicated staff and loving relatives. And somebody has, somebody is in a care home, they still have a right to family life. They can't be locked away from their families, and yet that's what's happening. And the emails that I've been getting and the evidence that's been given to the Joint Committee on Human Rights is so distressing and so wrong. So the government's right, but they've got to step up and make sure it's actually happening.
Yeah, and in doing that, would that mean that relatives get the chance to hug their mum, their son, their daughter?
Absolutely. We put in our regulations face-to-face contact, unless there can be a genuine justification. So they can't just have a blanket ban. They've got to actually assess each situation if they're going to say no. And, many of the residents have been vaccinated now, many of the relatives have been vaccinated, and they were feeling distressed and impatient before then, but they're even more distressed and impatient now because time has gone on and people deteriorate and feel a sense of abandonment. And yet they're thinking, well, I've been vaccinated, my mother's been vaccinated, her care home people can go in and out, some of them not even vaccinating, and why can't we? So I think it needs the law now.
And in terms of that becoming law, I mean, what happens next? This proposal, this legislation gets handed to the Health Secretary. What does he do with it?
Well, it's a very easy process. We've drafted what are called regulations so that the Department of Health don't have to do anything. We've got a very expert team of drafts people on our committee, the Joint Committee of Human Rights. So we've drafted the regulations. We don't need a new act of Parliament because what we're talking about is a regulated sector. It's already regulated by the Health and Social Care Act 2008. What we need is regulations made under the powers of that act, and that would have the force of law. And that could go through both the House of Commons and the House of Lords in a couple of days.
Wow.
So really, it needn't take any time. There would be strong support for it across the House of Commons. My committee has got members of the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and it's got different parties. It's got Lib Dems, Tories, Labour and SNP. We've looked at this carefully. We know what the situation is, and there's no time to waste.
Yeah, you've worked in the House of Commons and in politics for a long time, Harriet Harman. You know that it can be like turning around an oil tanker, trying to make what looks like the simplest of changes to something. So on the face of it, that sounds all very doable. Will the Health Secretary be susceptible to this? Do you think the government are open?
Well, I think you're right. Sometimes it seems to take an awful long time to make any change. But in this pandemic, Parliament has learned and the government has learned how to do things quickly. We've done things quickly to do lockdowns. We need to do this quickly to protect the right to family life. Just because you are in a home does not mean you don't have a family. Yeah. You do have a family, and that family cares about you and they want to be able to see you, especially if it's an autistic young person who finds communicating on the telephone, or somebody with dementia who finds communicating through FaceTime or video impossible. There's nothing like a family just being right there.
Absolutely, and I think most people would echo that. Harriet Harman, thank you. Labour MP, of course, and chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights. So who would disagree with anything you've just heard there? Now, back in November, connected to this, we brought you the terrible story of Ylenia Angeli, who was arrested in a garden centre, you may remember, a garden centre car park after taking her 97-year-old mum out of a care home. Liana's daughter, Leandra, filmed that entire incident. Have a listen.
So let's just make this very clear. My nan, my 97-year-old nan here, who we have taken from the care home because we haven't seen her for 9 months, is now being taken back by force to her care home. My mother has been arrested. My mother is in the back of the car here. She is a nurse.
We remember that well. Since we last spoke, the family have managed to get Tina, the grandmother, released from the care home in mid-December, is now being cared for by the family. Leandra Ashton joins us now. Leandra, nice to have you with us again. So your grandmother is now at home with you guys?
Yes, she's in the other room behind me right now.
Wow. This was just the most extraordinary story, but it was kind of symbolic, really, wasn't it, of so many other stories similar to this. Just remind everybody the difficulties that led up to this incident in the garden centre with you and your mum.
Yeah, so as a family, we are just the tip of the iceberg. There are hundreds of thousands of families in the same situation, not just in the UK, but all over the world, I believe. What led to this instance was us trying desperately to see my grandmother, offering all kinds of solutions to make that happen. My mum offering her services for free in the care home, offering services as a cleaner, as a cook. Obviously, my mum's a nurse. She was offering her services without any, question of remuneration. And everything we were met with was a no. I wrote to my MP. We spoke to social services. We raised safeguarding issues, which were ignored and were given back to the care home because we could see the dreadful deterioration that was taking place in my grandmother because of her isolation and because of the lack of contact with family. And this is what we're seeing again and again and again. Still we're being contacted by families in this same situation saying, the deterioration in their loved one is beyond anything that it's beyond heartbreaking. And yet still they're not being permitted in to touch, as your previous caller said, the person who texted in, Peter, not being able to touch your loved one it's the cruelest of tortures. It really is, particularly when they have dementia. And let's remember that the majority of people in care homes do have dementia. It's a big problem. So not being able to touch is totally confusing for them. And this is it feels like there is a tsunami of safeguarding issues that are taking place in care homes currently. And we're getting a sense of that, but it must be absolutely horrendous what's going on really behind closed doors at the moment.
Yeah, and you didn't get, you felt, as I remember, Leandra, you didn't get a lot of change out of the care home themselves. You didn't sense that they were necessarily particularly open to dialogue. Would that be fair?
Yes, I'd say that's fair. And I think what's most shocking is the fact that this is what we're coming up against time and time again with other families that we're trying to help, is that quite clearly the care homes and the local authorities and even the social workers are not aware of the legalities around this issue, or rather the illegalities. And I know that there's this question being raised now of making it illegal to not be able to visit your loved ones in care homes, but it's already illegal. It's already against Human Rights Act, Article number 8, which gives everyone the right to a family life. It's also arguably against Human Rights Act number 3, Article number 3, which is about unlawful detention, things that are normally used for prisoners or those in detention or those who are in asylum. It protects against cruel detention, and that's what's happening to our elderly. Yeah.
How does that sit then? Sorry to interject. How does that sit though with? I mean, care homes would say, look, regardless of that, we understand that. However, at the moment there's a pandemic, and we know it's easily caught, and people who are vulnerable might just find themselves with it. So, that at the moment that usurps the whatever other legislation is out there that you just outlined. That I'm assuming is their answer to this.
Well, they might argue that, but even within Article 8 of the Human Rights Act, so the right to a family life, the only way that an organisation is able to breach that is if they show that it is absolutely necessary and proportionate. That's the wording. Right. And as it is, it's not absolutely necessary and it's not proportionate, because we have shown with other families how you can gain access with proper risk management in order to gain access to see your loved ones. Yeah. And I think the other thing that we have to really keep our eye on is it's not the families necessarily that are bringing the virus into the care homes. It's the discharging of a patient from hospital with COVID back into a care home setting. This is the main problem. So I think to deny families that right is atrocious.
Yeah, and now we have we have better testing, we have vaccinations. I mean, those two factors themselves, one would have thought would be a game changer.
Well, you'd think so. You'd think definitely the testing would be a game changer, because you've got evidence that this person coming into the care home isn't carrying anything. Yet still, the care homes, the local authorities, local public health, social workers aren't upholding these rights. And also, there's another piece of legislation, which is the Mental Capacity Act, which again which would cover anyone that has any form of dementia, which is a large majority of the people in care homes. And one aspect of that is that there has to be the least restrictive option. And again, we're not seeing that. We're not seeing the least restrictive option. And
in terms of the events that led to you taking your nan out of the care home, what happened there? Was this did you have to jump through hoops even to do that?
Oh my goodness, you have no idea. I mean, I think the very, very steep learning curve that we had was to bring ourselves up to speed on the illegalities of what's taking place. We were bamboozled on the day that my mum was arrested. The police officer said there's a dolls that has been placed on your grandmother, a deprivation of liberty order. We weren't part of that process. And again, legally, a family member has to be part of that process, or at least informed that this process is taking place. So the amount of bureaucracy that we had to jump through in order to get my nan home was huge. And I think the majority of families aren't equipped. They don't have the personality or the courage to stand up to officials who are saying, no, you can't do this.
How's your nan doing?
She is doing amazingly. She's put on so much weight. She's got a little chubby face. She's singing. She's sleeping really well, which she wasn't before. She's singing. She's even singing. She's sometimes waking up singing, and she's talking to us in Italian back to her mother tongue.
Nice.
So, it shows what a bad state she was in the care home, and how well people can do once they're back with their loved ones, having that regular contact.
Great point to finish on. Leandra, thank you. Leandra Ashton, who you may remember filmed her mum, Ylenia, being arrested. This took place, of course, in the garden centre last year, sort of midsummer last year when this happened. And it was there were lots of different opinions on it at the time, but what it did do, it threw up and threw wide open that issue of the elderly, the vulnerable being essentially abused, because if you can't see your family or talk to your family through a window. And there were cases where you had people pulling the blinds down on relatives who are knocking on the window saying, I need to see my mum. And a total stranger pulling the blinds down. That's an absolute outrage. I don't know the answer, but that's an absolute outrage. No, you can't. You can't see your own mum. And possibly your mum maybe even witnessing this on the other side of the world. You had all of these terrible dynamics and awful things happening. We hope that's going to come to an end. You'd have to think the testing and the vaccinations will be a huge factor in this, right? An absolute game-changing factor. But Leandra just said, particularly the testing side of it, because you could give somebody a test, say, right, come back in 40 minutes, all good to go, the green light's on, in you go. Nothing, no problem whatsoever. Why not? Why would that not be as automatic as you like? If you've been there, seen it, and experienced that grim reality of being told you can't see your relatives. And again, this isn't, and Harriet Harman made this point, it's not just about elderly mums and dads. It might even be about your own kids who are having certain treatment or certain care, which means they're away from you and now no longer allowed to see your own child. I mean, those situations are incredibly desperate. We'll talk more on that in a few moments' time. 0344 499 1000. We're also going to speak about the British DNA a little later as well, with Sir Tom sadly dying yesterday. And in a way, I don't want to put the word sadly there in the sense that we should only be morose about the sad passing of Captain Tom, because there's a big old list, and it's in the thousands, of reasons why we should be jubilant as we celebrate the life of somebody like him. But I just thought it came at Interesting time on the back of that scumbag who was abusing Chris Whitty.